Olivia Carter let the thin strap of her satin slip fall from her shoulder, revealing the soft curve of her skin. The dim lighting in the bedroom painted golden highlights along her collarbone, her breathing slow, measured. Tonight was supposed to be special. She had planned every detail: the candlelit dinner, the expensive red wine, the delicate lace barely covering her body. She wanted to feel desired again. Turning towards the bed, she met Ethan Lancaster's gaze. He sat at the edge, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of his phone screen. His tailored white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, revealed the firm lines of his chest. The faint scent of his cologne, rich and masculine, filled the air. Olivia moved closer, the silk of her slip brushing against her thighs as she slid onto the bed beside him. Her fingers traced over his wrist, feather-light, a silent invitation. "I missed you like this," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't respond. His thumb continued scrolling across his phone, his posture relaxed, indifferent. Olivia hesitated, her confidence wavering. "Ethan?" His sigh was long, weighted. He placed his phone down but didn't meet her eyes. "Olivia, we need to talk." The unease crept into her stomach, cold and tight. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice softer now. Ethan ran a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair, exhaling sharply. He turned to her at last, his blue eyes cool, assessing. "This isn't working anymore." Her heart skipped a beat. "What?" He stood, moving towards the closet, undoing the cuffs of his shirt as if this conversation was nothing more than a routine inconvenience. "You know what I mean," he said, pulling off his watch. She shook her head, disbelief washing over her. "I don't. Explain it to me." Ethan turned, leaning against the dresser, arms crossed over his toned chest. He studied her, but there was no warmth in his gaze, only detachment. "You've changed." Her breath caught. "Changed?" He sighed again, heavier this time. "You're not the same woman I fell for. You don't take care of yourself the way you used to." The words sliced through her like ice. "You're saying I let myself go?" Ethan didn't deny it. "You're comfortable, Olivia, and I need something more." Her body went rigid, her mind scrambling to process the cruelty in his words. "Someone younger," she whispered, realizing it all at once. The flicker of hesitation in his expression told her everything. "I'm sorry," he said, but he wasn't. He walked to the chair, picking up his blazer. His movements were controlled, rehearsed, as if this had been planned long before tonight. "I've already spoken to my lawyers. The divorce papers will be ready soon." Olivia felt the world tilt beneath her. Her hands trembled, her vision blurred, her breath came in shallow gasps. She had given him everything, and now he was tossing her aside like she was disposable. Ethan glanced at his watch and adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, exuding the same confidence he always had, except now it was laced with cold indifference. "You can stay in the house if you want," he added, like it was a consolation prize. That was it. The final insult. The final proof that to him, she was no longer worth fighting for. He grabbed his keys, his cologne lingering in the air as he strode toward the door. Olivia didn't move. She didn't beg. She didn't speak. The door closed behind him. Silence. And then the tears came. Hot, endless, shaking her entire body. But beneath the pain, something else simmered. A quiet burning ember buried deep inside her. Not just sorrow, not just betrayal, but the first spark of something much, much stronger. She wasn't done. Not yet. And one day, he would see the woman he left behind, and he would regret it. The restaurant hummed with an air of exclusivity, filled with the quiet clinking of glasses and low murmurs of conversation. Olivia stepped inside, her black dress hugging her body, the fabric smooth against her skin. She had chosen it carefully, something elegant, yet with enough allure to remind Ethan of what he once had. The delicate gold chain rested against her collarbone, drawing attention to the subtle rise and fall of her breath. The slit of the dress revealed a tantalizing hint of her leg with every step, the high heels elongating her figure. She had spent extra time on her makeup, deep, sultry eyes, lips painted a soft nude that invited attention. She wanted to feel wanted again. Her eyes scanned the restaurant, finally landing on him. Ethan sat at a private table, effortlessly powerful, dressed in a tailored navy suit that accentuated his broad shoulders. His wristwatch gleamed under the warm lighting, a subtle reminder of his success. But he wasn't alone. Her breath hitched. Sitting across from him was a woman, young, flawless, radiant in a shimmering red dress that left little to the imagination. Olivia watched as she leaned in, fingers grazing Ethan's wrist, laughing softly at something he said. The sound was like nails against glass, sharp and unbearable. Ethan wasn't just done with Olivia, he had already replaced her. Her grip on her clutch tightened, nails pressing into the fabric. She forced herself to walk forward, each step controlled, deliberate. If he was going to throw her away, he would see exactly what he lost. She reached the table. Ethan barely looked up. "You're late," he said, his voice indifferent. Olivia sat down, smoothing the dress over her lap, ignoring the woman beside him. "I didn't realize there was a deadline," she replied, her voice laced with cool defiance. Ethan finally looked at her. His gaze flickered over her body, a flash of something unreadable crossing his expression. Maybe it was appreciation, maybe it was regret. But then he turned back to his glass of whiskey, dismissing whatever moment had passed. The woman beside him, Ava as Ethan introduced her, smiled sweetly, but Olivia could see the satisfaction lurking beneath it. She was the new model, the upgrade. The meal was torture. Olivia picked at her food, listening to Ethan speak with Ava in the way he used to speak to her, effortlessly charming, attentive, amused. When had she stopped being enough for him? Ava's laughter rang out again, and Olivia clenched her jaw. She couldn't sit there, being compared, being ignored. So she did what she knew Ethan never expected. She lifted her wine glass and took a slow sip, then leaned forward, just enough to let her voice drop into something silky, almost seductive. "You always did have a type, Ethan." The conversation at the table stopped. Ethan's fingers stilled against his glass. Ava blinked, clearly caught off guard. Olivia leaned back, crossing her legs in a way that exposed more of her thigh through the slit of her dress. She knew Ethan's eyes would follow the movement. They did. He exhaled through his nose, annoyed. "Olivia, don't start." She tilted her head, the corner of her lips curving into a smile that wasn't quite friendly. "Why? Am I embarrassing you?" Ava cleared her throat, clearly unsure of whether she should step in, but Ethan didn't respond immediately, because for the first time, he was looking at her, really looking at her, not as the woman he had grown bored of, but as the woman who no longer seemed to need him. Olivia held his gaze a second longer before setting her napkin down. "Enjoy your dinner?" She stood, her chair sliding back smoothly, and turned without another word. She didn't need to stay. She had already won, and Ethan for the first time realized that losing her might not have been his best decision after all. Olivia's heels clicked against the marble floor as she stepped into their penthouse for what she knew would be the last time. The scent of Ethan's cologne still lingered in the air, deep, woody, intoxicating. It used to make her weak. Now, it only made her sick. The city skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but all she could feel was the suffocating weight of the inevitable. Ethan was already there, standing by the bar, pouring himself a glass of whiskey like this was just another night. His tailored dress shirt clung perfectly to his broad shoulders, sleeves rolled up, revealing the strong veins in his forearms. He exuded effortless control, the kind of arrogance that once had drawn her in, but not anymore. He took a sip, finally acknowledging her presence with a glance. "You didn't have to leave like that," he said, voice smooth but lacking warmth. Olivia scoffed. "And watch you fawn over your new accessory all night? No, thank you." Ethan's jaw tensed, a flicker of something dark crossing his expression. He set the glass down with deliberate slowness, stepping toward her. "I didn't replace you, Olivia. I moved on." The words hit like a slap, but she refused to let him see it. Instead, she lifted her chin, lips curving into something dangerously close to a smirk. "Funny. I don't remember you ever waiting for me to catch up." Ethan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. He hated when she did this, when she matched his games, played by his rules. His gaze flickered down, tracing the way her dress clung to her body, the way the deep neckline framed her collarbones. His fingers twitched at his side, the memory of touching her still alive in his veins. She saw it, and she used it. Taking a slow step closer, she let the air between them charge with something thick, something unsaid. "You don't get to pretend this was mutual," she murmured, her voice low, deliberate. His breath caught. She was so close he could smell the subtle hint of vanilla on her skin, could feel the warmth radiating from her body. His hand lifted, almost involuntarily, as if to touch her, to trace the shape of her lips like he used to do in the early mornings when she was still tangled in his sheets. But she stepped back, and just like that, the spell was broken. Ethan's face darkened, frustration evident in the way his fingers curled into a fist. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he bit out. Olivia let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "No, Ethan. You did that the moment you decided I wasn't good enough anymore." His expression flickered just for a second, but she caught it. That tiny flash of regret, of uncertainty. But it was too late. She turned, walking toward the bedroom for the last time. The space still smelled of them, of heated whispers, tangled limbs, desperate hands exploring familiar skin. She reached for the closet, pulling out the suitcase she had packed earlier. The realization of finality hit harder than she expected. She wasn't just leaving a home. She was leaving the version of herself that once believed in this love. As she zipped up her bag, Ethan appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame, arms crossed. "You don't have to go tonight," he said, voice lower now, almost hesitant. Olivia met his gaze, searching for something, some flicker of the man who once held her like she was the only thing keeping him breathing. But that man was gone, and she wouldn't beg for a ghost. She walked past him without hesitation, brushing against his arm as she moved. His muscles tensed at the contact, his breathing shifting almost imperceptibly. He wanted her, still. But now, it didn't matter. She reached the door, gripping the handle before pausing just long enough to say the words that would haunt him long after she was gone. "I hope she's worth it." And then, without another look back, she walked out. The door clicked shut. Ethan closed his eyes, exhaling sharply, as the weight of what he had just lost crashed down on him. But by the time he realized the depth of his mistake, Olivia was already gone. And this time, she wasn't coming back. The apartment was silent. Too silent. Olivia stood in the middle of her new place, a space that felt foreign, empty, nothing like the home she had built with Ethan. The dim glow of the city lights filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Her heels were already discarded, her hair a mess from where she had absent-mindedly run her fingers through it, trying to make sense of everything. The faint trace of his cologne still lingered on her dress, a cruel reminder of a man who no longer belonged to her. Her body ached, not from physical exhaustion, but from the weight of it all. She let the silk slip of her dress fall to the floor, pooling around her feet. Standing there in just her lingerie, she walked toward the mirror, bracing her hands on the vanity as she finally forced herself to look. The reflection staring back at her was not the woman she once knew. Her dark eyes were swollen, her lips slightly parted as she struggled to catch her breath. The delicate lace of her bra barely concealed the rise and fall of her chest, each inhale sharp, controlled, like she was holding herself together by sheer will alone. She traced a finger down her own collarbone, across her bare shoulder, feeling the smoothness of her skin. It was a touch she used to crave from Ethan. Now, it was just hollow. Her mind betrayed her, pulling her back into memories of him, of his hands gripping her waist, his mouth tracing the sensitive curve of her neck, his voice rough with need as he whispered against her skin. Heat flushed through her, not from arousal, but from the sick realization of how easily he had erased her. Her fingers tightened against the vanity. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't break. Not for him. Not anymore. She turned sharply, walking toward the bathroom, her steps quick, determined. The cool air kissed her exposed skin as she stepped into the shower, turning the knob until steaming water poured over her body. It scalded her, washing away the remnants of him, erasing the way his touch had once made her feel alive. Her hands ran over herself, over the curve of her hips, her thighs, her stomach. She was still here, still whole, even if he had made her feel otherwise. The water dripped down her back, tracing the delicate arch of her spine. She closed her eyes, tilting her head back, letting the heat consume her. The pain would fade. The scars would heal. And one day she would look at herself and see a woman Ethan could never touch again, a woman he would never be able to forget, and that, she decided, would be the beginning of her revenge. The rhythm of Olivia's heartbeat matched the pounding bass of the music echoing through the private gym. The air smelled of sweat, ambition, and determination. Every muscle in her body burned, her pulse racing as she pushed herself harder, faster. Her toned legs flexed beneath the tight black leggings as she lunged forward, beads of sweat sliding down the exposed skin of her lower back. The fitted sports bra hugged her curves, the deep V revealing just enough to make heads turn, if she had been paying attention. But tonight, her focus was singular. She gritted her teeth, tightening her core as she lifted the weights, feeling the deep stretch in her arms. Each repetition was a promise to herself, a promise that she would never be discarded again. She caught her reflection in the wall-length mirror and paused. Her body had changed. The once soft edges were now sculpted with strength. Her stomach flatter, her waistline carved with new definition. The curves Ethan once took for granted now had an undeniable edge of power. She wiped the sweat from her collarbone, exhaling sharply. This wasn't just about looking good. This was about reclaiming herself. Her lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. The next time Ethan saw her, he wouldn't just want her back. He would ache for her. She picked up her phone, scrolling through the unread messages. Some from old acquaintances, others from men she barely remembered meeting, all of them trying to capture her attention, but one caught her eye. A name she hadn't seen in a long time, a man who had once been off limits. Her fingers hovered over the screen, and then, just for fun, she replied. A harmless flirtation, a reminder that she was no longer waiting for anyone. The heat of the moment still burned in her veins as she left the gym, her body humming with adrenaline. She walked out into the cool night air, the sweat on her skin making the breeze feel electric. And as she slipped into the back seat of a waiting car, she ran a hand through her damp hair, tilting her head back with satisfaction. The next phase of her life had begun, and this time, she was the one in control. The air inside the high-end lounge was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, aged whiskey, and quiet seduction. Olivia stepped inside, the clicking of her heels barely audible over the sultry jazz playing in the background. Every movement of her body was deliberate, her shoulders pulled back, her hips swaying with an elegance that turned heads without effort. The dress she wore was designed for destruction. A deep emerald silk hugged her curves like it was made for her, the plunging neckline teasing enough to draw attention, while the thigh-high slit revealed smooth, sculpted legs that could make a man forget his own name. And tonight, there was only one man she wanted to see her, Ethan Lancaster. She spotted him instantly. Seated in a private booth, whiskey glass in hand, he was mid-conversation with a group of executives. His tailored black suit stretched over his broad shoulders, his presence still commanding a room effortlessly. But tonight, she was the storm in his control. His gaze flickered up, likely out of habit, scanning the room in his usual cool indifference. And then he saw her. His entire body stiffened, fingers tightening around the glass before he even realized. For a moment he looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. His blue eyes traced over her, slow, calculating, starting at the sharp cut of her collarbone, down to the soft curve of her breasts, barely concealed by silk, lingering at the dip of her waist, before stopping at the long stretch of her bare leg peeking through the slit. The muscle in his jaw twitched. Good. She walked past his table without acknowledging him, her perfume leaving a faint, tantalizing trace in the air. Let him watch. Let him wonder. She stopped at the bar, feeling the weight of his gaze still on her. Sliding onto a velvet stool, she crossed one leg over the other, the motion deliberately slow, the silk parting just enough to make his throat dry. The bartender approached, and she barely had to lift a finger before a glass of red wine appeared in front of her. A presence moved behind her. Close. She smirked before even turning. Olivia. Her name on his lips was lower than usual, controlled yet rough around the edges. She could almost taste the tension in the air. She turned, her lashes lowering just slightly as she met his eyes. Ethan. Silence stretched between them. The last time they stood this close, she was walking out of his life. And now she could see it, the hunger in his expression, the way his gaze dropped to her lips before dragging lower, devouring her curves in a way that wasn't just appreciation. It was regret, and that was the sweetest victory of all. She lifted her wine glass, taking a slow sip, letting the red stain her lips. "Something wrong?" she asked, tilting her head just enough for her perfume to brush against him. Ethan exhaled sharply, his throat bobbing as he forced his eyes back to hers. "You've changed," he murmured, voice rougher than before. She set the glass down, licking a trace of wine from her lower lip, before leaning in slightly, just enough to make him feel the warmth of her body without giving him what he wanted. "No," she whispered. "I just became everything you weren't ready for." And with that, she turned away, leaving Ethan standing there, breathless, stunned, and completely undone. Olivia could still feel his gaze on her, burning through the fabric of her dress as she turned away. It was intoxicating, the silent pull between them, the undeniable force that made the air feel heavier, hotter. She didn't rush. She let the moment stretch, allowing Ethan to absorb every inch of her presence. She knew what he was thinking. That body, that confidence, that fire, none of it belonged to him anymore. And yet, he couldn't look away. A slow, deliberate sip of wine touched her lips before she finally exhaled, forcing herself to ignore the way her skin tingled from his proximity. The past had no place here, but Ethan. Ethan had other plans. She barely registered the movement before he was beside her, close enough that his scent, clean, rich, unmistakably masculine, invaded her senses. A presence too familiar, too dangerous. "You really think you can ignore me?" His voice was deep, steady, but laced with something more, a challenge. She let a smirk play at her lips, setting her glass down with deliberate grace. "I don't have to ignore you, Ethan. You don't exist in my world anymore." His jaw clenched. She could see the flicker of something dark in his expression, something possessive, something primal. She turned fully toward him now, her dress shifting against her skin like a lover's touch. The slit in the fabric parted just enough to reveal the toned line of her thigh, smooth and glistening under the dim lounge lights. Ethan's gaze dropped, just for a second, and that second was everything. She leaned in slightly, not touching him, but close enough that the heat between them was suffocating. "But you seem affected." His throat bobbed, his fingers curling into fists at his sides, as if resisting the instinct to reach for her. "You walk in here looking like this and expect me not to react." His voice was lower now, almost strained. Olivia tilted her head, her own pulse quickening despite herself. "I don't expect anything from you anymore, Ethan." She let her words linger in the space between them, savoring the frustration tightening his muscles. He had once told her she wasn't enough, and now she was too much for him to handle. The silence between them stretched, thick with tension. Then he did something unexpected. His fingers brushed against her wrist. Light, just a whisper of a touch. But it was enough. Her body betrayed her, heat flooding her veins, memories rushing in, the ghost of his hands tracing patterns over her skin. But she wouldn't let him win. She slowly pulled back, her lips curving into a slow, devastating smile. "You're exactly where I wanted you, Ethan." His brows furrowed, his breath coming heavier now. "And where is that?" She leaned in just enough for their lips to almost touch, her voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. "Watching me walk away." And she did. This time, she didn't look back. But she knew. She knew that for the first time in his life, Ethan Lancaster was the one left wanting. Ethan stood frozen, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides, as Olivia disappeared into the crowd. The scent of her perfume still lingered in the air between them, tormenting him with every breath. She had walked away. Again. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly how it felt to be discarded. His body was tight with frustration, the hunger in his veins unrelenting. It was unbearable. Seeing her like this, watching the confidence that dripped from every movement, knowing that he no longer had the right to touch her, to claim her. His gaze burned into her as she made her way toward the far end of the lounge. The way her hips swayed beneath the silk of that damn dress, the way the slit revealed just enough of her thigh to make his blood run hot. She was irresistible, and the worst part was, she knew it. She knew exactly what she was doing to him. And then, as if the universe wanted to punish him further, he saw it. A man. Tall, dark-haired, sharp-jawed, approaching her like he had every right to. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched Olivia turn toward the stranger, tilting her head just slightly, her lips curving in amusement as he leaned in to whisper something against her ear. She laughed. It was soft, seductive, a sound Ethan used to know intimately. Something snapped inside him. Before he could stop himself, his legs were moving, his body cutting through the crowded lounge like a predator stalking its prey. Olivia sensed him before she saw him, that familiar heat, that magnetic pull. Her body reacted instinctively, skin tingling as a shiver danced down her spine. She turned her head, just in time to see Ethan closing the distance between them. The air shifted. The man beside her hesitated, glancing between them, sensing the sudden, invisible battle lines. Ethan didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. His fingers brushed against Olivia's wrist as he passed by her, just enough to send fire racing through her veins. A calculated touch, possessive and infuriating. She sucked in a breath, but before she could react, he was beside her, leaning in so only she could hear. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" His voice was low, rough, edged with something dangerous. Olivia smiled, slow and devastating. "More than you know." Ethan exhaled sharply, his lips so close to her ear that his breath sent goosebumps racing down her skin. "You're playing a dangerous game, Olivia." Her heart pounded. She hated that his presence still did this to her, that her body still recognized him, still remembered the way his hands used to explore every inch of her, the way his mouth used to leave her breathless, but she refused to let him see it. Instead, she tilted her chin up, letting her fingers trace absent-mindedly over the rim of her wine glass, looking unbothered. "You lost the right to warn me about danger, Ethan." His jaw flexed, his body taut with frustration. For the first time, he had no control. For the first time, she was the one setting the rules. And as she stepped away, leaving him standing there in his own torment, Olivia realized something. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about freedom. Ethan wasn't thinking anymore. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out the jazz music, the murmur of conversation, the clinking of glasses. The world around him blurred as he watched Olivia slip through the crowd, her silhouette a siren call wrapped in emerald silk. He had never been the kind of man who chased, but tonight that rule no longer applied. His legs moved on instinct, his body tense with something primal, something restless. He needed to be near her. Olivia felt him before she saw him, that slow-burning heat pressing against her skin, that pull in the air thick and undeniable. She had been expecting this. The moment his fingers wrapped gently around her wrist, she let out a slow, knowing breath. "Following me, Ethan." His grip tightened for a brief second before he forced himself to let go. She turned to face him, tilting her head slightly, her lips just barely curved in amusement. But her eyes were dangerous. The dim lighting traced over her features, the high cheekbones, the full lips still stained from wine, the delicate slope of her neck. Ethan's gaze dipped lower, to where the silk of her dress hugged every curve, the plunging neckline teasing just enough to test his self-control. His breath came heavier. "I wasn't finished talking to you." Olivia lifted a brow, clearly entertained by his struggle. "That's unfortunate, because I was." She turned as if to leave, but this time Ethan moved faster. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path, his chest inches from hers. His voice dropped, low and deliberate. "What do you want from me, Olivia?" She inhaled slowly, the scent of his cologne, rich, deep, familiar, curling around her senses like a dangerous memory. She wanted to tell him that she wanted nothing, that he was already part of the past she had buried. But her body betrayed her. The warmth between them was unbearable, her skin tingling from his nearness. Every nerve in her body remembered his touch, the way his hands once owned every inch of her, the way his lips used to trail fire down her spine. Her fingers curled slightly, resisting the urge to reach for him. She met his gaze, refusing to let him see just how much he still affected her. "I don't want anything from you, Ethan." Lies. His lips twitched, as if he could hear the unspoken words. He leaned in, the edge of his jaw grazing her cheek ever so slightly. Not a kiss, not even a full touch, just enough for her to feel his warmth. Her breath hitched. "Then why do you still react to me?" Her stomach clenched. His voice was lethal. A quiet seduction wrapped in confidence, soaked in history. But Olivia wasn't the woman he left behind. She wouldn't break for him. Not again. Her lips brushed dangerously close to his ear as she whispered, voice smooth as silk. "Because I like watching you suffer." She pulled back just in time to see his expression shift. Frustration, hunger, something dangerously close to regret. And then she walked away. For the second time that night, leaving Ethan standing there, fists clenched, chest rising and falling as if she had just taken the air from his lungs. Ethan had never felt powerless, not in the boardroom, not in his personal life, and certainly not when it came to women. He had always been in control until her. Until Olivia walked back into his world, unattainable, untouchable, a masterpiece he once owned and foolishly let go. And now he was the one chasing. His breath was heavy as he found her again, this time on the terrace, where the city stretched endlessly beyond the glass barriers. The moonlight bathed her in silver, highlighting the soft curves of her body, the bare skin peeking through the slit in her dress, the delicate curve of her collarbone exposed by the off-shoulder design. She was breathtaking. She was his ruin. He stepped forward, his voice rough. "Olivia." She didn't turn immediately. Instead, she took a slow sip of her wine, as if weighing whether he deserved her attention. When she finally did, her gaze was unreadable. "I thought we were done with this conversation." Ethan exhaled sharply, his frustration curling into something dangerously close to desperation. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" She tilted her head, the faintest smirk tugging at her lips. "Shouldn't I?" His jaw tightened, his fingers itching to touch her, to remind her of the fire that still burned between them. But he had no right. Not anymore. His voice softened, breaking past the tension. "I was an idiot." Something flickered in her expression, but she masked it quickly, turning her gaze back to the skyline. "That much is obvious." Ethan took another step, closing the space between them. "I never stopped wanting you." That did something. Her grip on the glass tightened just slightly, the rise and fall of her chest becoming more pronounced, but she refused to turn. Ethan moved closer, his breath warming the side of her neck, his voice dropping to that husky tone that once unraveled her. "Tell me you don't feel this." She swallowed hard, the memory of his touch pressing against her skin like a phantom ache. She could still remember the way his hands used to grip her waist, the way his lips claimed every inch of her body, leaving her trembling, begging, "No." She refused to be that woman again. Her voice came out steady, even as her pulse betrayed her. "I feel nothing, Ethan." Silence. Then his fingers brushed her bare arm. A whisper of a touch, so light it could have been imagined, but she felt it everywhere. Her body tensed, heat curling in her stomach, spreading like wildfire. Ethan felt it too. Liar. His voice was dark, knowing. His fingers moved again, this time tracing the curve of her shoulder, his touch deliberate, agonizingly slow. Olivia's breath hitched, her body betraying her just for a second. A second too long. Ethan turned her to face him, his blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent shivers through her spine. "Tell me you don't want me to kiss you right now." Her heart pounded. She knew this game, and she also knew she would win. She leaned in, so close their lips almost brushed, her breath mixing with his. His hands hovered near her waist, aching to hold her, to reclaim her. And then she smiled. "I don't." She stepped back. The loss of her warmth hit him like a punch to the gut. Ethan exhaled through his nose, his frustration barely contained. He had never wanted something so badly. But Olivia, she was already gone. Olivia felt the weight of his stare even as she walked away, her pulse still erratic from the intensity of their exchange. The cold night air kissed her skin, but it did nothing to cool the fire still burning inside her. Ethan Lancaster, a man who once had the power to consume her. A man who was now drowning in the ruins of his own arrogance. She exhaled sharply, stepping into the dim hallway leading to the hotel elevators. The soft click of her heels echoed, her emerald dress clinging to her every movement, the high slit revealing teasing glimpses of smooth skin. She was in control. Until she wasn't. A presence behind her. A familiar, heated force moving closer, his energy wrapping around her like a storm she couldn't escape. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. Ethan. Her breath caught as the elevator doors opened, and without a word, she stepped inside. She should have been surprised when he followed. She wasn't. The doors slid shut, enclosing them in an intimate silence. The tension between them thick, dangerous, electric. She kept her eyes forward, watching the numbers ascend, refusing to acknowledge the man standing inches behind her. But then, his scent, that intoxicating mix of spice and musk. The same scent that once clung to her sheets, to her skin, to the spaces between her thighs after long, breathless nights. A cruel reminder of what he had once been to her. Ethan shifted, his body heat pressing against her back, close enough to make every nerve in her body tighten with awareness. Then, his voice. Low, rough, devastatingly close. "You're running, Olivia." Her fingers curled into fists, nails digging into her palms. No, she wasn't running. She was winning. She tilted her head slightly, just enough for her lips to part in a slow, knowing smirk. "I never run, Ethan." A dark chuckle rumbled from his chest, the sound vibrating through her bones. And then, his fingertips. A feather-light touch grazing along the exposed curve of her arm. A touch that sent a violent shiver down her spine. She hated that he still had this effect on her. Hated that her body still recognized him, still responded to him as if no time had passed, as if he hadn't once broken her into 1,000 pieces. "Then why do you tremble when I touch you?" Her breath hitched. Bastard. The elevator dinged, the doors sliding open to an empty, dimly lit hallway. She stepped forward, escaping the charged air between them, refusing to let him see how much he still unsettled her. But Ethan wasn't done. Before the doors could close, his hand shot out, stopping them. Her pulse spiked as he took a slow step into the hallway, his presence filling the space like a shadow she couldn't shake. She turned to face him, chin lifted, refusing to show weakness. His eyes burned. Dark, intent, unrelenting. "Say it, Olivia." Her brow arched. "Say what?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Say you don't want this, that you don't feel this." His voice was raw, almost desperate. For the first time, he was the one begging. Silence stretched. Olivia's breath came shallow, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew what he was doing. He wanted her to break, to admit that no matter how much she wanted to punish him, she still craved him. But she wouldn't. Not this time. She stepped closer, closing the space between them, her gaze steady, unwavering. Then, with the faintest smile, she leaned in, so close her lips almost brushed his. Ethan's breath faltered. She could feel the tension in his body, the heat radiating from his skin, the raw, pulsing hunger between them. And then, just as quickly, she stepped back, leaving him starving. "Good night, Ethan." She turned on her heel, walking away, leaving him standing there, breathless, aching, and utterly defeated. Olivia could still feel the weight of Ethan's gaze on her long after she left him standing in that hallway, desperate and undone. The heat of his touch still lingered on her skin, even though she had refused to let him pull her back into his orbit. She exhaled sharply, closing the door to her suite behind her. The silence was thick, pressing against her, but it wasn't loneliness. It was clarity. She walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window, the city glittering below her. Her reflection stared back, illuminated by the dim glow of the skyline. She looked different, stronger. Her lips still tingled from the nearness of his, her body still humming from the tension between them. But it wasn't longing, it was power. Ethan wanted her, he ached for her. But that was no longer enough. A knock at the door made her pulse spike, even before she turned. She knew. The air shifted, the heat curled through her veins again, deep and restless. Slowly she walked across the room, her silk robe slipping off one shoulder as she reached for the handle. She opened the door. Ethan. Tall, broad, devastating in his open-collared shirt, and the raw hunger burning in his gaze. He looked wrecked, like a man who had finally realized the depth of his mistake, like a man who had everything, but lost the only thing that ever mattered. Neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, electric. Then his voice, low, almost broken. "Olivia, don't do this." She lifted a brow, tilting her head. "Do what, Ethan?" He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair, stepping closer until the warmth of his body nearly touched hers. His scent curled around her, intoxicating, dangerous. His fingers twitched at his sides, as if aching to grab her, pull her in, make her his again. But she didn't move. She let him suffer. "I can't lose you," he admitted, voice rough. "Not like this." Olivia studied him, her expression unreadable. For a moment her body betrayed her, her heart hammering, her breath shallowing, the memories of his hands, his lips, his body against hers rushing in like a tidal wave. But then she remembered. She remembered the pain, the nights she spent alone, feeling unworthy, the way he discarded her as if she were replaceable. And just like that, the spell was broken. She leaned in, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath, her lips just inches from his. Ethan's muscles tensed. His fingers curled into fists. He was waiting for her to surrender. She didn't. Instead, she smiled, soft, knowing, cruel. "You already lost me." She stepped back, watching the way the words shattered through him, the way his body tensed, his jaw tightening as if physically restraining himself from reaching for her. Ethan exhaled, his chest rising and falling with something close to desperation. She turned toward the door, her fingers gripping the handle. One last glance over her shoulder. "Goodbye, Ethan." And then she was gone, this time forever. The city pulsed with life, a rhythm Olivia had finally learned to move to. The air was crisp, the streets filled with people chasing their own ambitions, their own stories. She was no longer lost in someone else's shadow. She had become her own story. The boutique cafe was warm, filled with the scent of fresh espresso and vanilla. She sat by the window, the soft hum of conversations blending into the background as she scrolled through emails on her phone. Then, something made her pause. A presence. She felt it before she saw it, the weight of a familiar gaze. Slowly, she lifted her eyes, and there he was, Ethan, sitting alone across the street at an outdoor table, fingers resting against a half-empty glass of whiskey. His suit was impeccable as always, but his expression, that was different. He wasn't the same man who had once dismissed her. There was no arrogance in his posture, no confidence in the way he held himself, only regret. And the worst part? He wasn't even trying to hide it. Olivia inhaled slowly, tilting her head, watching as his gaze traced over her, slow, reverent, almost painful. She knew what he was seeing, a woman he once owned, a woman he had let go, a woman he would never touch again. Her lips curled into the faintest smile, not to taunt, not to tempt, but because she finally felt nothing. Ethan blinked, his throat working as if he wanted to say something, to fix something. But there was nothing left to fix, because Olivia Carter was no longer his unfinished business. She was her own masterpiece. And as she stood, tossing a few bills onto the table before walking out into the world that now belonged to her, she knew one thing for certain. Ethan Lancaster would never forget her, and that was his real punishment. Olivia's story isn't just about heartbreak, it's about rebirth, about losing everything you thought defined you, only to realize that you were always enough. How many times have we given our love to someone who never truly saw us? How often do we stay, hoping they'll realize our worth, when the truth is we were never the problem? Olivia's power wasn't in revenge. It wasn't in making Ethan suffer. Her true victory. She moved on. She became a woman so untouchable, so unforgettable, that the man who once discarded her would have to live with his mistake forever. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever walked away from someone who didn't value you? How did it change you? Share your experience in the comments. I'm reading every single one. And if you loved this story, you don't want to miss what's next. Click on the next video now and get ready for another irresistible romantic journey. Because trust me, it's even better than this one.